few million people may get to see a Broadway musical on stage, but when the show is over, all that remains are the memories and the original cast album. How do these albums get made? Where do they fit in today's market? What do they mean to the long-term legacy of a musical? Hello, I'm Melissa Rose Bernardo, and joining me to discuss those questions and more are Ted Chapin, President and Executive Director of the Rodgers and Hammerstein Organization, Kurt Deutsch, Co-founder and President of Shikaboom Records, Brian Drutman, Vice President, Broadway and Soundtracks, Decca Label Group, and Recording Executive and Producer, Tom Shepard. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
It seems like to produce cast albums, you really have to love them. Would you guys agree? Because the record industry, it seems like such a small part. Those of us who buy them and love them, we're so passionate about them, they're our world, but it's a pretty small part of the record industry. Would you agree?
Unfortunately.
What are we doing?
That's it, I'm leaving, that's it.
No, but I also think that part of the answer has to be putting it in perspective, because there was a time before cast albums were known where Broadway was the feeder for the pop world. And so people listened to the theater, to the score of a musical, and went and recorded the songs individually, and it really wasn't until the early 40s that someone said, wait a minute, why don't we take the cast that knows the material, take the orchestra from the theater, let's go into a studio and let's start at the beginning and do the whole thing and put it together. So, and then through the years of cast albums being as important a part of the musical theater as anything, that was great, and now we're in a different time for a lot of reasons, and so you're absolutely right that you have to love cast albums to be in any way part of the making of them these days.
So, yeah, and I would also add to that you have to love musical theater and the history that comes with musical theater, and the cast album is, because it's live, and the audience sees it live every day. The cast album is really one of the only things that people remember from the show. So you're really documenting a piece of history, whether it's the performer, whether it's the composers, whatever it is, that's that time capsule, that thing that you have. And it's a tremendous responsibility and honor, at least I consider it, to be able to, I look at it as just an incredible honor to be able to just capture all of these recordings, and that's what I love about what I do.
And and further, sort of to Kurt's point, for so many of us who didn't get to Broadway a lot when we were kids, it was our one connection to the Broadway show. It was what made us interested in. You talk to young actors today, and they heard the albums, and that's what got them interested. And further, it's what recaptures. What Kurt's talking about, sort of the recreating the show. It's, for me, what recreates the show in my mind, and if I enjoy the show, this has helped bringing that memory out and the things I liked about it. And what makes it also interesting are the things that are often on the album that are not in the show, in terms of performances or just any number of augmented things, which we as connoisseurs come to point out and realize it's just an added element, added layer to it.
Lieberson was a master of making those very subtle but wonderful additions. And I remember I heard the cast album of Gypsy long before I saw the show. And in the cast album, when Ethel Merman is singing Funny There's a Stranger Who Comes Here, there is this rather magnificent string line that's like 3 octaves and a fifth above her, tracking her. It's very, very beautiful. And I went to the show, and boy, I can hardly wait to hear this live. It wasn't there. It was a Lieberson, and absolutely. And the other thing I remember distinctly, among many things that Goddard did, was that if it was an intimate song, he would generally try and go for an intimate ending, because he knew he didn't have to reach for applause on the recording. So he could be truer to the material sometimes than the practical considerations of the show allowed. It's a very interesting way of thinking of records as really their own art form and not as documentaries.
Right, I think that's a pretty interesting point. I mean, how as a producer, I'm taking over the moderator role here.
Go ahead, please.
I'm going to ask you questions now.
Go ahead.
You know, what changes do you make for the sake of the recording?
Right.
How much time you got?
An interesting thing that happened we were recording the new cast album of Next to Normal. There's a song that the daughter sings, and it's called Everything Else. It gets interrupted by one of the actors, but it's a great song for a young girl. She's sitting at a piano singing this great monologue about her life, and it doesn't end in the show. It just gets cut off. And so in talking to the composers and everybody, I said, you know, this would be a fantastic audition song for somebody one day, for a young actor. I said, why don't we just, let's end the song. What's the last, if she were to make the last word, what would the last word be? And then let's just end it. So it's a complete song now on the record. In the show, it's not a complete song, it gets cut off. So that's one of the things that, in thinking about what you're talking about, what we do, and as far as the orchestrations go, with the sound design and all of the actors singing, it's always important to hear the words. It's rare that you really, you know, everybody says, actors even say, I never knew that the orchestra was doing that.
Yes.
So you really get to hear what the orchestra is doing. And the orchestrations, because, you know, God loves sound designers, but they're at a constant battle of what you can hear.
Right.
So you really get to hear these orchestrations, and people work really hard on them, and they're fantastic.
And in the theater, basically you're hearing them monaural, because you're getting most of the sound from a loudspeaker, and it's the whole thing pumped into one speaker. So you lose the spread of the orchestra as well, very often in the live theater, which is unfortunate.
Can I ask about technology? This is something that fascinates me. Once upon a time, the technology of making a recording, and therefore making a cast recording, went with the companies. The company developed the technology. They had their own studios. You couldn't get into this Columbia Records studio unless you were at Columbia Records. You couldn't get into where RCA recorded. And they tried things along the way, Dynagroove, Stereo 360 sound. Do you find, Tom, that since you have produced records from the sort of the days of tape going around and around?
Yeah, we used to drive to the studio in a covered wagon.
No, not going back that far.
Yeah, okay.
No, but because today it's all on a hard drive and it's all
There's
is
something
computer.
called tape. Tape.
Yeah.
But is it easier? Is it less? Is it more complicated because you have more possibilities today?
I think that intelligent use of tools, which is what all these things are, is to make your job easier. And I find that because of the technology and because of the flexibility and the way we can insert things and change things and put them together and work entirely within a digital domain, that we have much more freedom than we ever did before. The technology isn't running us. We're really running it, and I think it's wonderful. But you lead me to another point, you know, which is when it began with 78s. Now we're even before tape, and generally there were 10-inch 78s. A tune ran 2.5 minutes. If you were in the world that we were in at that time, which was that the greatest Broadway songs became the hit parade, the top 40, whatever, then very often, even on the cast albums, you would condense those songs to be 2.5 or 3 minutes. Then I think it was either Kiss Me Kate or South Pacific, where Goddard actually did it on 12-inch 78s, I mean, along with the LP. But to a great degree, your storage medium has a lot to do with the way you plan something. And if you were planning things in 2.5 or 3.5 minute segments, you made a different kind of album. The LP came along and you had at least 20 to 25 minutes on each side. And so what you were planning was not only where do you break it, but how do you end the first side on some kind of dramatic high, irrespective of whether it's the act breaker.
Right.
Okay, and then along comes the compact disc, and there is no act, there is no turning of the thing over, so you can now think in terms of another kind of, and so you can start through composing, as it were, the thing. And now look what's happening now. For 99 cents, you download a tune, and we're back to the single. You know?
Well, or we're back to an unlimited amount of time,
Yes.
because we're not constricted only by the unions. Are we constricted with time, because you can actually record. There's no, you can record 90 minutes or 100, whatever it is. You can record the entire show because you just download onto your iPod.
Right.
And also, I would go back to the technology, because what you were talking about, the tools, is what makes cast albums so alive is their energy. You basically record in a day, right? For the most part, you go in and you record it. And so in the history, there's a lot of imperfections. There's a lot of, people singing out of tune, or you capturing performances, and you're capturing the energy of the performances. And that's what makes cast albums special. The danger with all of the tools that we have now is that they become sterile. And they become, you can make everything perfect. Mm-hmm. And I think that is somehow loses sometimes the energy of, when you go see a show live, you're seeing this, you want to capture these real performances. And so I think that there's a constant balance between lining every note up perfectly, making everyone singing perfectly on tune, and you lose that breath of a live energy.
I think that is such an important point, because in the days when they were made absolutely in a day,
right.
When you had to capture the stage performances in a day, you had no choice but to create an atmosphere in the studio where everybody's relaxed, because actually the clock is going faster than anybody wants to know, and yet you have to do that. In this recording of Allegro that we just did at the R&H office, where we did it the old, in a way we did it the old way, in that it's a completely created cast album in a studio done bit by bit.
Right.
But our mantra was just what you said. We want this to sound like they've just come from the theater, mm-hmm. and they're giving performances that they were giving on stage. None of them were. There's dialogue in that recording of two people who weren't even in the studio at the same time, but
right.
Bruce Pomahack, who was one of the producers of the album, had it so in his mind that he even, one of the actors said to him, you're giving me line readings. Some people think I know how to do this.
Oh, that's true.
And at the end, he listened to it, and it's like, no, Bruce knew exactly the way to make that line work with that line.
Right. Yeah.
I think there's a medium point in this. I mean, you were at the company recording sessions. One of the memorable moments is Stritch being amazingly slightly out of key during the whole, and that's just great. I wouldn't want to do anything to have a pitch adjuster to change her.
No.
At the same time, if there's a bad habit that some kind of musical tick that you can fix, fix it, because the show you only watch once.
No, you're 100%. You're 100% right. I mean, I say to actors when we go into the studio, I say, I'm more interested in your performance. If you get close to the note, I can fix it. You know what I mean? But because we can, but it's your performance that we want to capture, and it's less about, because a lot of these actors have never been in a recording studio before. They're never used to sing. I mean, we should talk about how we actually make these albums, but they have these headphones on. They're saying it's completely foreign to them. The band is in isolated booths, and the actors are in isolated booths, and they're all used to doing it together. So it's a very foreign thing, and they've never done it before, and they have one day to do it, and they get shot out of a cannon, and they do it, and we do it. But it's, we have the technology to make it great. But we have to use it in the right way, I think.
How much help do you guys get from the director, the music director, the composer? I know some composers, maybe like Stephen Schwartz, might be more hands-on than others. How does that work? How do you balance that?
Well, it's interesting that a lot of composers want to produce their own albums now, and it's always fascinating to have them in the studio, because they're bringing the responsibility as a creator in with sort of their knowledge as a producer. Often you have them creating sort of the sound that they want to hear. They're deviating slightly from what's being performed on stage. That can work also, because as we said, it isn't really a facsimile of what you saw on stage. The album has to exist, has to have its own life. So that could be interesting to have them there. But I guess it depends on who the director is. Most directors, on albums that I've worked with, are in the booth at the time and make comments. But for the most part, their work is sort of ended when the production opened. It's what's going on in the studio is not really their concept. It's moved to a different point.
I like to have a very collaborative process. I rely heavily on if the director is interested in being involved, I welcome it. I love it because the actors are comfortable with the director. They're comfortable getting notes from if I'm saying, you know what, I think that performance needs to be this. Coming from me, who they've never met me before, it's who are you?
The outside,
you know what I mean?
right.
So if I can work, Walter Bobby, when we did White Christmas, or I've done a couple of records with Walter, we have a great relationship. I can talk to him, or anybody can talk to him, and there's a chain of command of who communicates with the actors. The orchestrator, the composers, and the musical director are a team amongst themselves, and so there's a level of communication that happens in that world that when you listen to the music. So there's different departments, I think, and you try to put together a team of people who can work together, and then you have a level of communication that is clear when you're in the studio. And then as far as mixing goes, there's a lot of people who, but it's really the composer's records, ultimately.
I was just thinking back to Secret Garden, just by way of an example. I usually, if I'm going to make, not usually, I always, when I make a cast album, I try to figure in my head, what kind of album do I want to make? What's the overriding philosophy or whatever of that album? So it generally means that I'm having meetings very early on, weeks before the actual recording session, with the composer, with the arranger, with the dance arranger, and with, if it's another person who wrote the book, with them, so that together we can pull together a recording. How much dialogue between the songs? Do we have to change the underscoring because the amount of dialogue is now different? It doesn't time out the same way. How do we make use of the stereo field? Are we going to take advantage of motion, of what's forward, what's backwards, what's intimate, and so, having said all this, it means that we've already established a give and take working relationship many, many weeks in advance of the recording session. And when we go in there, we're pretty much on the same page, and the surprises or whatever happens in the studio. So the people we know the least well, I guess, are the performers. And so they rely on us very, very heavily. As you said, they're not used to being on a sound stage in a recording studio. They're used to being on a stage. And so one of the good things for us is that it makes them perhaps a little bit more reliant on us because they know that they're now working, in our ballpark. So I find it's an interesting mix where you get to know the production team very, very well, but the people you seem to know the least well, at least are the ones who are actually doing the performing.
Tom, you were talking about the various aspects, using stereo, depth, stuff like that. Yeah. I want to put you on the spot. You made an album of 2x2, and there's a song called Put 'Em Away. Do you remember it?
I know exactly what happened. There were about 5 of them on stage, right? Everybody but Noah was singing the song.
Right.
And I wanted it to sound like we were going from person to person and making this judgment.
They all think the father's out of his mind.
Right.
So it's the family wanders over and gets a word from the father.
Right. So I thought, what the hell? Why don't we actually do it with footsteps? So they were real footsteps. I mean, depending on whether it was Harry Gaz or I'm trying to think of her name now. The wonderful woman with the extraordinarily loud and unpleasant voice.
Oh, her.
Oh yes. Now I can talk
narrow
about millions of people. But so they all wore different shoes. I mean, that's the way life is. They all walked at different speeds. Marilyn Cooper, wonderful actually, and. But so yes,
character voice by design.
Absolutely. Yes,
very well said.
No, but what I love it's one of the moments that I use to illustrate the notion of what you can do theatrically in stereo on the show, because do you want it all to be, as Tom said, dead center mono as you hear it in the theater, or do you want to use the spread? Of course, you have to be careful if you use the spread, because sometimes you're listening to it someplace where you're not going to be able to get both channels.
Right.
But in that one where Danny Kaye is over there and they walk back and forth, and then at the end the last thing he says is so outrageous that you feel it sounds like they're tumbling over each other to get over to the other side of it.
Right.
And again, you have to use that, I think, very carefully in cast albums, but it's a theatrical.
Yeah, I mean, are you making a radio play? Are you making, you make choices. I mean, we're getting ready to record Hair Monday, and we, there are a lot of Hair records, right? And I was, because it's Passover on Monday, I was having a Passover moment last week, thinking what makes this album different from all of the other albums out there, and obviously the production is very different. The show is there's a lot of different things in it. When the original cast album was made, it was on vinyl, so they couldn't record all of the music. There's songs that are different. There's different orders. Questions came up. Do we put dialogue in it? How do we tell the story? Is this a radio play? Is it a collection of songs? All of those questions. Working with the director and Galt, the composer, were asked, and we sat around for about 4 hours figuring out what record do we want to make? Why is this record different, and how will it be different in this new age? What was very important was that we capture the spirit, the energy, the tribal. It's really, this production, I think, has very much, more than at least what I've seen, a tribal energy to it. And because we're not reliant on length, we can create the Grateful Dead version of this album. It can really feel tribal. And so that was a word that kept coming up in what we were thinking about. And so we've created a recording script that we'll end up using. And so it's been fascinating process of doing it.
I love the word energy, which everybody has used here, because I think if there's one thing that, in sort of thinking back to why those of us who love cast albums, there's a kind of energy in good cast albums, even if it's quiet moments. I mean, I think of the Vamp and Chrysanthemum Tea and Pacific Overtures. I mean, they're not playing it fast, but there's something there's an energy to it that I think it's what makes the good cast albums differentiate from the not good cast albums.
So, what are some of the not good cast albums? Would you guys name any?
Oh, we have a common.
Do we have?
Well, no, the original Follies.
Oh, well, yeah, that's a project we have, actually.
Because it was incredibly chopped up, right?
Yes. I mean, I'll take this one a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to Tom.
Go for it.
Having worked on the original production of Follies, in the heyday when a lot of record companies liked making cast albums, and it's interesting to track which company got which show, and for some reason Capitol got Follies, even though some of the ones that had come before had been done by Columbia, and they were going to do a 2-record set, and they weren't going to do a 2-record set, and they weren't, and they finally decided they didn't, so they truncated everything on the original cast album. It was made in the ballroom of Manhattan Center on portable equipment. And the equipment was having problems all day long. So on top of the one day that you have in the studio, half the time was eaten up by buzzes and microphones and things. It was not a very cool day. So the recording, the ultimate recording of the original production, was not great. There's some magic to be found in there, but it's not great. So I actually watched Tom from the upper level of the Waldorf Astoria at some lunch, and somebody invited me, and I looked and I thought, then Sondheim was there as well, and I thought, Tom Shepard, RCA Victor at the time, Stephen Sondheim, you know what? Tom should make a decent recording of Follies. So I wrote it, and we had lunch.
You came to the office. And you suggested the idea.
Yeah, and you said the concert.
And you
the
said,
rest is history.
Let's do it. And I said, let's see if we can do it live. And
it's a great recording.
Which segues into something that I'd love to talk a little bit about here, which is how albums get financed. Because
I was going to say, I've come from the corporate world, so an unsuccessful cast album is one that doesn't make any money.
Right.
Of which there are many, but anyway.
And you were one of the few people left in a big corporation, and And I wondered.
Yeah, I'm running it and running it into the ground. No, but the.
Do you think you still have a job because of Mamma Mia and Wicked?
or the largesse of my boss.
And a lot of wonderful reissues too. You've put out a lot.
Yeah,
of
well, it's just there's so many aspects to this, and the mold was, of course, that the large record companies made all the records, or most of them at one point, and Kurtz created a new model which is unbelievably successful, and that's fantastic. And so now I think you have a variety of models and financial kind of considerations and methods to do these. The one thing, I guess the reason that the corporations are still interested in doing cast albums, I mean, aside from the windfall on an occasional album, is that they want to have them in the catalog. The corporations can exploit the cast album in many areas. Songs can be licensed out for TV or radio commercials, into films, and that kind of thing. So there's a great deal of opportunity there. I know composers like to be with large corporations for the same reason, that their work gets out there and is seen and heard.
They cost a lot of money to make, and the reason they cost a lot of money to make is because the rules that were sent down from the many years were made when Broadway music was extremely popular, were the hits of the day. So the unions and the producers have made deals because the major record labels would always pay for their records, so when they were at the negotiating table, they never thought that they would ever have to foot the bill for these records. So make the record label pay for it, and the record label did. So an actor, when they go into the studio, gets a week's salary for every 8 hours they're in the studio. The orchestrator gets 100% reuse for all of their orchestrations. I'm not going to go into the details, but a big Broadway cast album can cost $400,000 or more to make.
Or more, yes. Lately it got more. I don't know what that.
$700,000.
Yeah.
But and then when you add marketing to that, marketing a cast album, in stores, online, advertising, it can get up there, and the audience has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So something needs to be done if these albums are going to continue in the long-term future. I mean, we can't even record albums anymore because all of the recording studios are basically gone. There's no big room in New York anymore to really record a cast album. So there's a big problem in the cast album world, which I think will affect Broadway in the long run. And producers and unions and the league and everybody have to get together to really solve it. And like the world, we don't really solve problems until it's
until you're drowning.
Exactly. So right now we're sensing, and we always make do because we can, but ultimately there's going to need to be some addressing of this issue in the future. I think.
I had a thought some years ago, which I still think is a decent one, which is for a particularly big show, a show that's an expensive show. If the producer of the show built the recording into his budget in much the same way that they build in an overcall, I mean, the chances are, if I'm making this up, so you correct me if I'm wrong, but let's say if the show is a $5 million show, being able to put aside a little less than 10%, which would be $400,000, would cover the recording, and this way the investors in the show, the angels, would know that come hell or high water, whether the show sinks or swims, they're going to have an album.
Well, that's what we do. I mean, we've been basically how a lot of this started with us was came from looking at a recording contract and realizing that that producers or performers would make a record, but they would never really ever see any money from the album. It came kind of backwards. And so in thinking about it, I was like, well, I'll put up some money and we'll make a record with my wife, and if people like it and they buy it, then we'll make money, and they won't. And I didn't really think about distribution at the time, but anyway, now I have to think about that. But that same contract that was given to my wife was also given to shows, and so shows rarely made made any money off of these records. And so in thinking about it, I said, well, why can't the producers help foot the bills for these? And then ultimately it becomes more of a profit sharing thing, and if it makes money, then everybody kind of makes money.
Because they're going to sell them in the theater and the concessions.
Yeah, unless you have the producer who feels that the cast album is strictly a marketing tool, which a lot of them do feel, and in that case, it's better to put it off on a bigger label and let somebody else spend the money to market my show, so I can market my show. I mean, it depends on the project and who the producer is and
how many producers
and whether they've ever made any money on a cast album, which a few have, but not a lot,
Right. It's all divided. I mean, if Disney's going to produce a show, Disney's going to be making that record because they have that infrastructure in them. Producer wants to produce their show. They don't want to necessarily worry about, I want to produce a record. They don't want to necessarily worry about that. But it is another asset in their portfolio. And on top of that, it's really for the future of life of the show. Without a cast album, a show is forgotten.
Right.
It doesn't exist in the world of, I mean, you run a licensing. How important is a cast album in your world of licensing a show?
Important than which version?
Exactly. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it's fascinating, again, when you look at how, as you point out, the union rules really should be looked at, because orchestrators getting a second, I don't mean in disrespect to orchestrators, but getting paid, again, for work you've already done once, when you probably get a royalty in the theater, which they never did in the old days to begin with. There's a little bit of a lot of people who have through the years have pulled for themselves, and it makes $400,000. And how many CDs or downloads do you have to sell?
You have to for a $400,000 album, or let's say for a $500,000 album, you have to sell about a little over probably 120,000 units.
We're
to
a
make
little
your money
higher
back.
because we have greater distribution costs. But yeah, that's right.
Somewhere around a little over 100,000 copies to make the money back. And how many cast albums sell 100,000 units now? Yeah, very, 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 very few, if hardly any.
I mean, Wicked, I'm sure has.
Well, Wicked, Wicked and Jersey Boys and
Right.
Phantom years ago, but those are not the majority of
Legally
cast
Blonde
albums.
and Spring Awakening now have sold those.
And well, I know
That's it.
Spring Awakening.
But I mean, it's on one hand you can count them.
Spring Awakening did, if I remember, some more interesting marketing too. I think they really went after kind of college kids.
Well,
they pushed like ringtones. I personally have a Spring Awakening ringtone.
Good.
I wake up every morning to the bitch of living. It seems appropriate, right? So that, but that really seemed like kind of a fresh way to market the recording.
Well, I'll tell you the thing that we found in Spring Awakening, which I found fascinating. We expected it to do extremely well as a digital download because the composer was young and had a pop music following. He's a pop songwriter and composer, Duncan Sheik. And because the nature of the show was a little younger and the demographic was viewed as being younger, so we assumed that the on iTunes where we were selling it or any digital download would do extremely well in conjunction with the cast album. For most of our cast albums, we do about maybe 15% on iTunes. 15% of the albums are sold on iTunes. Spring Awakening did raise that bar for us up to maybe 25%, or maybe even up to 30%, but that's not what we were expecting. I think we were expecting it to be even a little higher. And so the conclusion I drew from that was that people like cast albums as souvenir items. The most number of sales we do on our cast albums are at the venue, at the theater. Really? And when a show is touring, and if it's a production which has multiple tours, you do that much better. But that's where people are buying it. So it's still viewed as people want the package and they want everything that comes with it. So
and they want the thing that's interesting that differentiates this from popular music is it's about the record. It's not about the song. It's, you know, people are buying whole albums, which is actually a beautiful thing about Broadway cast albums. Our experience for a show like Legally Blonde is we're selling 60% digital.
Wow.
Which is enormous. And so we're seeing digital as being a little bit, you know, it's around 30 for the catalog, and then the 30% for the catalog. So, but a title, and I think MTV certainly helped with Legally Blonde and the reality show and everything. And In the Heights is doing a big digital business.
Well, and you guys did with Passing Strange and In the Heights and Next to Normal, the digital advance release.
Right. Well, for me, I you know, if a show is open, I want to get the album as fast as I can.
Right. Absolutely.
And the way that the distribution world works right now is you deliver a record and you have to wait months to get it into the store, to get it out into the world. When I master a record now, I can, from the time I master it, it can be up on iTunes in 3 weeks. So if a show's run, that's records I'm not selling if a show's running. So I want to get it up as fast as I can. I don't really care how people get it, as long as they can somehow get it.
So what's the ratio, would you say, between like the digital sales and the actual hard copy sales?
At least for my catalog, I'm about 25% in the theater, 30, based on the whole catalog, about 30% digitally, and then the rest traditional retail. And traditional retail includes Amazon. So that's what's going on with at least me.
I mean, what was interesting was people were reluctant. Well, we were reluctant. We're people, I guess, to release too early digitally, as opposed to sort of the bricks and mortar, as they say, the traditional retail venues, because we didn't want to aggravate, we didn't want to antagonize our traditional retail partners. But since so many of our retail partners are out of business, we don't care so much about antagonizing the ones that are still left. Well, I mean, you know, it's funny. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 years, because we don't. I mean, from the retail standpoint, we don't know where it's going. We don't know what's going to be left.
Right. And also, it's such a regional. I mean, if you think about it, you know, Broadway's really, really important in our 8-block world. You know what I mean? And we care about it tremendously. But it's you know, it takes a long time for it to saturate into the ether, and so the people that care about it will find it, hopefully. And so. You know, there's 1,000 or 1,200 people a night that are seeing this show every night. Those are the people you want to come away with. I mean, I want them to want to have that music. I want every single person to walk out of there wanting the music and to live with it forever. And if people are interested in it beyond that, fantastic. But I want to get those people to buy.
And isn't it interesting that a while back you couldn't buy a T-shirt in the theater, and now not only T-shirts, but that's the main venue for CD sales. When in the old days, if you grew up in Cincinnati, you went to your local record store, waited for the new cast album to come in. Right. You know, and it's interesting. That's just interesting that it's kind of switched in a way that the promotional aspect of it is now connected directly with the show, not as in anticipation of the show. I think that's interesting. Does anybody miss 12-inch pieces of cardboard with potential lots of writing and photographs? I mean, I feel like the guy with the gray hair here.
Well, the older I get, exactly. The older I get, and the worse my eyesight becomes, the more I miss the large print. Yes.
I miss the artwork a lot. I really do.
That is at least the nice thing about CDs. You have the liner notes, and mostly you get the lyrics, and there usually are some great, you know, someone who's incredibly knowledgeable writes some kind of terrific pan to the production, and there are great production shots, sometimes from the recording session or some historic photos.
Most LPs had lousy photos. I mean, unless it was a gatefold with a spread inside. My memory were very badly reprinted.
Well, I can only speak for Columbia in those days, but the thing is, everything about the album was ready weeks before the recording was actually made. So a lot of the pictures that you saw, as well as everything, the pictures, the liner note, the show art, was all created in advance, because the last thing to fit into the package was the piece of vinyl. And as a result, there was always a disclaimer somewhere in the bottom right corner,
Right.
which says, selections as of, whatever it was, January 15th, New Haven, because that was the last chance the company had to make corrections on the jacket, although in fact they could make corrections on the label up until the last minute. So you will often find on these albums a discrepancy between the label and the back of the album. But these are problems that I don't think you have to face anymore.
Right.
Because,
well, no, we do to a certain degree. I mean, with 13, we did 13 this year. It's very important for Jason Robert Brown, God love him, to have the record before we opened. And I said, well, there's not going to be any more new songs, right? No more new songs. You're not going to cut any songs. We do. The record doesn't really bear any resemblance to what actually happened opening night. At least there were 2 songs cut, and now when it gets licensed, there's going to be a new song. And but we had the record opening night. There was an album in everyone's hand, and my kid loves listening to it. So
Yes.
so we did do that, but there were 2 songs that were cut, and so I will now probably remaster that album and add a new song in the future so that it reflects properly the show that will ultimately be performed in the future.
Yeah, that is one of the things that we have found at Rodgers and Hammerstein. It's very important for us not to record a version of a Rodgers and Hammerstein show if the new material for a specific production is not going to be made available. Whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, if it's available, the customers want it. And if it's a new dance that was put into The King and I, they want that dance. So we got to be careful of that because it always creates problems. It's like, no, you don't need that. You don't need it. You don't want it. We gave permission for it specifically, but
Right. And in an ideal world, when to record the album is a very important thing, because you want ultimately to record the final version of the show. I just think that it costs so much to make.
Right.
These records. Document what it is, and then that will ultimately be what gets licensed and what people will remember and want to see. So that and then that's your thing that you have.
But he wanted every 12 or 13-year-old girl who saw the show to be able to say, "Mommy, buy me that CD," as soon as they were walking out of it.
It's that, but it's also recognizing that the album, the music, is going to help sell the show. So if that song 13 or any other title on that show caught on, and it got out there virally because these kids are, he's not wrong in thinking that. Make the album as fast as you can, get it out there, because that's going to sell the show. And the music, it's because, you used to have newspapers and ads, right? Now, those ads are banner ads on websites that can have music playing, and you're trying to sell a musical. So if you click on something, you hear music, oh wow, that sounds really great. I want to go see that. Your ads now can sing, which is fantastic. And so you can use all of these tools, this technology. The internet opens up a very wide, videos, music video. We just did a music video for Next to Normal that is caught on for this, that people say, oh, I love this song, I want to go see this show. So we're able to open up a lot of different, and so Jason was right, the album is good, it's just, I wish that it would reflect what's ultimately the show from opening night,
I think it can cut both ways, because there are collectors who are absolutely maniacal about every piece of material that a show had. And certain shows, Camelot comes to mind, had songs in it which were in the show when it opened, and then in that case, Moss Hart came back and he cut them out. So the people who have the original recording of this have additional stuff. There is a kind of collector who loves
the completists.
Exactly, the completists, the Miles Kruger.
Right. I want to ask Tom, you talked about Goddard Lieberson, who is kind of the guru of cast albums. I do not think there is a bad performance on a single album that says produced for records by Goddard Lieberson. How could he do that? Today you can futz a little bit and do the orchestra and then bring singers in, but in the days of Goddard Lieberson, it was Sunday, the day off after the opening, and he just did it. Did he have a kind of magic in the studio? I mean, it just, when you hear Mary Martin in the original cast album of Sound of Music, she has no voice. She has no voice, and you don't care.
No.
It's an absolutely confident, wonderfully theatrical performance. Or was it not Goddard? Was it an engineer or something? I don't know.
It's an interesting point. I never thought of it before, but I just think that the man generated, we said energy before, an energy and a magnetism and a trust. I mean, the people, remember, they weren't working with a show recording producer, that they were working with the president of the company. There was a whole different thing. I mean, Goddard, I mean, anybody whose nickname is God, you know, he can't be all that, you know? And,
but also, he's the man. Is he not the man, and are you not the man? You know, in your record, sometimes you are, sometimes you aren't. At the microphone that says, take one. I mean, that is the one talking to the performers that is, in essence, producing from an artistic standpoint what the performances are that are going to be captured.
I was asked to do the reissue production of Bells Are Ringing. And in the process, I managed to listen to a lot of the recording session, which was not, in fact, issued. You know, just, you know, the give and take on the session. And I wish I could remember distinctly, but what I do remember, in essence, was the way Lieberson worked one-on-one with Judy Holliday on The Party's Over. You know, where she was even, you could hear it, she was in tears once in a while because she was trying to do something that she wasn't quite sure she could do. But Goddard, particularly with the leads, not with the secondary characters, but particularly with the leads, he worked very closely with them, and not just behind the glass. It was not the other side of the glass. Goddard got out there, and that certainly influenced me very, very much. I mean, I never had his people skills, but I did learn to open the door and walk in the room and talk to people. You know.
Yeah, it's an important thing of when do you go and you speak to them between us, or when do you press a button and give them a note, and how do you get a performance out of a performer? I mean, the reason that we can do these in a day is because they do it 8 times a week. So it's in their muscles. It's in their bones. There's no rehearsing. You get up there and you push a button, you press play, and you hope you capture you hope you capture magic. But you want to make it as comfortable and as easy for them as possible in order for them to be able to do that.
Do you believe in allowing actors to come into the booth and listen to it themselves, or do you think that's a mistake?
I think that some people, my wife, would not like to listen to herself. She becomes self-conscious if she hears it. Some people actually like to listen to themselves and say, "Oh, I wish I would have done that differently. Let me go do that," and I'll go do it. But I think that it really depends on the performer,
I mean, and it has to be somebody in a sort of a significant role. I always think of that famous picture of Mary Martin holding Richard Rodgers' hands and sort of the playback of The Sound of Music. But I mean, you can't have 25 people coming in and listening to every song, going, "Yeah, I missed my line in the back."
Watch out for the oboist.
But exactly as Kurt said, I mean, I think if it's a solo number and a strong one, maybe in a strong acting performance, maybe the actor wants to know that they can go back.
And there's sometimes that you say, you know, you're trying to get something out of a performer, and you try it a few times. You say, you know what, come here and listen to this, because we're not communicating. Just listen to this, and you tell me if this is what you're intending, you know, or what we're trying to do, and they hear, oh, I see, okay, and then you.
I'd like to.
Oh no, I was just going to say it's something they don't get on stage, where they have to trust in the director to guide them. Here, they can redo it themselves.
The thing is, these people are generally not vocalists per se; they're actors, and they're used to conveying what needs to be conveyed through everything visual as well as audible. And sometimes what they're doing with their face or their body is not necessarily reflected in what they sound like. I was thinking, I was doing a revival recording of Zorba, with Anthony Quinn and Lila Cordova. And Quinn's a scary guy. I mean, he's just so much larger than life, you know, and I probably had just seen La Strada on TV. Too. I mean, the guy was scary, but very likable. And I can't remember the selection right now, but there was one number that he was duetting with Kudrova where everything looked perfectly wonderful to watch them do it, but just to listen to it, he got too angry too soon. He had nowhere to go. He may have still had it to go in his face and his body, but he didn't in his voice. And he was very receptive to that kind of note, you know, to say, you're getting too mad too quickly. He said, can I hear it? This is where we so we played it for him and said, oh, I know exactly what you mean. And so there, you know, you not only validate your own feeling, but you're on the same team. Mm-hmm. He doesn't feel that you're trying to make him do something that's antithetical to his nature or to his performance, but that you're trying to create something that when the sets, lights, and costumes have disappeared, represent the emotional trajectory of the material. That's a very fancy sentence. I mean,
it sounds good to me.
The song sounds good, you know?
When you listen to these stories and you hear about the pressure that everybody is under to create a cast album, it's kind of a miracle that there are any. And that they are as good as they are.
That there are so many.
Yeah, that there are so many, absolutely.
There are often, at least today, there are often conflicts, not at the session, but maybe a conflict with a producer about what they want to do, whether it's post-production or include on an album, and say, you know, the record company that feels it's going on too long, or you know, which is typical, you know, sort of showbiz quarrels that we often have, and they can get heated, and you try to find a compromise, but not usually at the session. I've found. I mean,
when actors have to record to a pre-recorded track, there's an odd thing about that, and we've just had a wonderful experience with Audra McDonald, who is an extraordinary performer, and she was recording a song in Allegro to a pre-recorded track, and she listened to it, and she did it, and she was fine, and then she got through and she said, I just feel like I'm being a good girl. Can't I just do it? Can't I just cut loose? And of course, knowing that the orchestra's not going to change, we said, of course, like that. And the next take was magical. It was it was like the difference of a performer marking it very well, and then an actor just taking it on and just acquiring it for her own. It was great.
Come home, where the brown birds fly.
I want to ask you about discs that you wish you could have produced. Maybe things you lost out on, or things that other people did that you just admire a whole lot, that you just love and listen to and think, gosh, I wish I could have done that.
West Side Story. I think it's an incredible original cast album. Yes.
I would have loved to have done Spring Awakening. I felt really passionate about the show, just as far as kind of the future of musical theater, and I loved the show. It was, you know, I saw it at the Atlantic Theater Company. I'm friends with the producer and the director and a lot of the performers, and just wished that I could have been part of it. I love it. So that's all. I wish I would have done it.
You touched on an interesting subject of how do some companies get some projects and others don't, and unfortunately, a lot of it's just economics now. I mean, years ago, record producers and record companies built up relationships with composers, with authors, and you could sort of bank on that. And unfortunately today, a lot of that it just comes down to who's going to offer the most money, whether it's in advance or whether it's a marketing spend, and I'm not sure that. What I don't hear is, let's go to such and such a record company because they're going to make a better record than this person.
It used to be true, though.
Yeah, you don't hear that today. You just hear, let's go to them because they have greater distribution, or you know, what have you.
Columbia had a reputation for making really good cast albums, and RCA did not. Although some great albums went to RCA because they had an association, you know, with George Marek and David Merrick. So a lot of stuff went there, and some very good stuff went there.
Does that go back to the technology and the people who were involved, because it was more of kind of contract, and the studios and like the team, you know, there was one team that did these, so was it that?
There were decades when certain companies dominated.
First
The
was
40s were Decca very
Decca,
much,
right.
and then the 50s Columbia
50s,
for sure,
yeah,
and then
some of the
then
60s,
RCA,
and then RCA in the 70s.
Right.
No, I think also, you know, I feel like this show's becoming a tribute to Lieberson, but he really kind of deserves it. People wanted him to do his stuff. They knew he understood where they were coming from. He knew that he was part of that world, and so he was a colleague, as well as being a president, but he was a colleague. And I don't think the other labels had anybody in charge of shows who brought that aura or that charisma to the task. I mean, George Marek was producing them with Andy Wiswell, and neither one of them were in any way ineffective people. They both knew very well what they were doing, but they didn't have the sense of theater. They didn't know how to make the transition or the translation from what you see to what you hear. And Goddard was unique that way.
But
yes.
then the shift did go to RCA at one point when a certain producer named Thomas Z. Shepard moved over from Columbia to RCA, and then it had the focus for a period of time.
He reads my cue cards. It's unbelievable.
But you were also an executive. I mean, because that's another thing.
That's right.
You went into the studio and made the cast albums, but you also sat at a desk by day to figure out what the division needed to do.
It also meant that I had a hand in choosing what shows we were going to do. You know, so it was a dual thing. It was a lot of fun.
Well, thanks. This was a lot of fun, and
thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank you
so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. These programs are brought to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in partnership with our friends at CUNY TV. On behalf of the American Theater Wing, I'm Melissa Rose Bernardo, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Working in the Theater.
I'm Ted Chapin, chairman of the American Theater Wing. The Wing has played a vital role in New York's theatrical life for more than 60 years. Best known for creating the Tony Awards, we stand for excellence, but we also support education in the theater, and our work reaches beyond Broadway in New York. The Working in the Theater television programs, which are supported by the Annenberg Foundation and the Dorothy Strelsin Foundation, are unequaled forums for discussions with today's most creative artists. Downstage Center's in-depth radio interviews were created in conjunction with XM Satellite Radio and can be heard on our website. Our annual theater company grants support New York not-for-profits, and since they began, have distributed nearly $3 million. We are also pleased to be the home of the Jonathan Larson Grants, which support emerging composers and lyricists. For people who are starting their careers, we have a 2-week boot camp for aspiring actors from colleges across the country called Springboard NYC. And our theater intern group provides a forum for young people who are starting their careers to build a professional network. All of the American Theater Wing's educational and media programs are available for free on demand from our website, americantheaterwing.org. Thanks for your interest in the Wing, and thanks for watching.